He had been invisible for so long that when they finally looked at him, really looked, it was already too late for some of them. Logan Pierce sat in that conference room with his hands flat on the table and his jaw tight and said nothing because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't cost him everything. His daughter was 8 years old. She needed lunch money and a father who came home. That was the only math that mattered. But the man across the table was smiling, and that smile was the most dangerous thing Logan had seen in a long time. If this story hits close to home, drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow along to the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The alarm went off at 5:47 every morning, and Logan Pierce never once hit snooze. Not because he didn't want to. There were mornings, more than he'd ever admit to anyone, when the pillow felt like the only thing holding him together, when the darkness behind his eyelids was the only place in his life that didn't ask anything of him. But then he'd hear it, the small sound from down the hall, a shifting of bed springs, a little girl turning over in her sleep. Emma. 8 years old and still the only reason he got vertical before the sun did. He'd shower fast and cold because the hot water in the apartment took 4 minutes to arrive, and he didn't have 4 minutes to spare. He'd make coffee, 2 cups, 1 for now, 1 for the thermos, while he packed Emma's lunch. Not the prepackaged stuff. Emma was allergic to preservatives, or at least that's what the pediatrician had suggested 2 years ago when her stomach kept acting up, and Logan had never stopped reading labels since. Turkey on whole wheat, a small bag of sliced apples with lemon juice on them, so they didn't brown, a juice box, and 1 small square of dark chocolate because Emma called it her thinking fuel, and he didn't have the heart to argue with that kind of logic. By 6:15, he'd have her awake. Not with noise. Emma didn't respond well to noise in the morning, something she'd inherited from her mother, along with her dark curly hair and her tendency to read the same page 3 times when she was nervous. Logan would open her curtains just enough to let a stripe of early light fall across her bed, and then he'd sit on the edge of the mattress and say her name once, quietly, and she'd open her eyes and look at him with that expression that was somehow already exhausted and already curious at the same time. "Is it a school day?" she'd ask every morning, as if there were any chance the answer might be no. "It's a school day," he'd say, and she'd sigh, this theatrical, full-body sigh that was so exaggerated it made him want to laugh. And then she'd sit up and reach for the water glass on her nightstand, and the day would begin. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in the Riverside district, 6 blocks from Emma's school, and 40 minutes by train to the offices of Callaway Meridian Group, where Logan had worked as a contract analyst for the past 3 years. 3 years. He'd intended it to be a stepping stone, a year, maybe 2, build the portfolio, get the reference letters, move somewhere permanent. That had been the plan. Plans had a way of getting complicated when you were doing them alone. He wasn't bitter about it, or he tried not to be. There were days when the word contractor sat in his chest like a stone. No benefits, no vacation days, no seat at the table when the permanent employees talked about the future. But he'd learned to carry it without showing the weight. Emma didn't need to see him carrying weight. She was 8. She needed lunch and consistency and a father who could look her in the eye without flinching. Logan was good at not flinching. He wasn't good at much office politics. That had become clear in the first month at Callaway Meridian, when he'd made the mistake of doing his job too well and too quietly, and attracting the kind of attention that neither category was supposed to draw. He was a contract analyst. He processed data, ran projections, prepared reports. He was supposed to be invisible in the way furniture was invisible. Functional, present, unremarkable. He'd managed that for the most part. What he hadn't managed was avoiding Brandon Cross. Brandon Cross was this kind of man who made a room smaller just by walking into it. 41 years old, senior manager of the analytics division, and the closest thing Callaway Meridian had to a weather event. Unpredictable, loud, and capable of causing damage you didn't fully understand until afterward. He had the corner office 2 floors up from the bullpen where Logan worked, and he had the habit of coming downstairs without warning, which everyone in the bullpen understood to mean that someone was about to have a bad day. He'd targeted Logan for the first time about 4 months after Logan joined. It had been small at first, a comment in a meeting about the length of one of Logan's reports, delivered with that smile that wasn't a smile. I think our friend Logan here mistakes volume for value. More words, Logan, doesn't mean more insight. Might want to remember that. The room had gone quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone is pretending not to have heard something. Logan had nodded and said nothing. That was the first mistake, apparently. Because Brandon Cross, Logan came to understand, needed a reaction. He'd built his entire management style on the principle that people who didn't push back were people who could be pushed further. And Logan, who had a daughter to think about and a contract that could be terminated with 2 weeks' notice, had chosen the path of least resistance, which had made him the most convenient target in the building. Over the following months, it had escalated in ways that were subtle enough to deny and consistent enough to be undeniable. Brandon would assign Logan extra work on Friday afternoons, the kind of work that technically needed to be completed by Monday morning. He'd question Logan's analyses in group meetings, not because the analyses were wrong, they rarely were, but because questioning them was an easy way to remind everyone present where the power in the room lived. He'd send emails that were copied to senior leadership, emails that framed Logan's work as adequate when it had been excellent, or raised concerns about timelines when the timelines had been met. Logan documented all of it. He had a folder on his personal laptop, not the work laptop, never the work laptop, where he kept dates and times and exact quotes, because he wasn't naive and he wasn't going to walk into some future HR conversation without receipts. But he hadn't done anything with the folder. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment, for something concrete, for a pattern that was clear enough to be undeniable rather than just deeply uncomfortable. The truth, if he was honest with himself, and on the train to work, with Emma's drawing of a horse tucked into his jacket pocket because she'd pressed it into his hand that morning and told him it was for good luck, he allowed himself to be honest. The truth was that he was afraid. Not of Brandon Cross, exactly, but of the machinery Brandon Cross represented. The machinery of a workplace that had no real obligation to protect a contractor, that could look at a complaint from Logan Pierce and look at a denial from Brandon Cross and decide that the cost-benefit calculation didn't favor the guy with no benefits, so he kept his head down. He did his work. He rode the train home and picked up Emma from the after-school program and made dinner and helped with homework and read one chapter of whatever book they were working through together, and he kept the fear separate from all of that because Emma deserved a father who could be present, not one who brought his office home in his eyes. It was a workable system. Until the Tuesday in October, when Brandon Cross blew it apart in front of 11 people. It was a team meeting, the quarterly sync that Brandon ran for the analytics division, usually an hour of status updates and budget talk, and not much else. Logan had been sitting in the third row of chairs arranged in a loose semicircle in the main conference room. He had his laptop open and his notes pulled up, and he'd already mentally timed out after the first 20 minutes because there was genuinely nothing in the agenda that required his attention. Brandon had been in a mood from the start. Logan could always tell. There was a particular quality to Brandon's voice when he was looking for someone to take something out on, a brightness that was too sharp, like a light with the dimmer cranked past comfortable. The meeting had been wrapping up. People were starting to close laptops, shuffle papers. Brandon had been talking about the fourth quarter priorities, and then, without any logical transition, he'd stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at Logan. Pierce. Not a question. Just a name dropped into the room like a stone. Logan looked up. Yes? I want to ask you something. Brandon's expression was pleasant in the way that made Logan's stomach contract. You've been with us 3 years now. Contract, I know, but still. You know how this company works. I think so, Logan said carefully. You know who Victoria Hale is. Everyone in the room knew who Victoria Hale was. She was the CEO of Callaway Meridian Group. 30 years old, which was the thing most people mentioned first, that she'd made CEO at 30. Brilliant, direct, and famously private. She wasn't the kind of executive who wandered the floor or showed up at company happy hours. She ran the company from the 22nd floor and communicated through controlled, precise channels. And in 3 years, Logan had seen her in person exactly 4 times. All in large, all-hands settings where he'd been one of 200 people in the room. Of course, Logan said. Brandon's smile got the quality it got. You ever think about her? Personally, I mean. The room went very still. Logan felt it. The collective held breath, the sudden sharp attention of everyone in their chairs, the way this sentence had shifted the gravity of the entire space. He looked at Brandon steadily. I'm not sure what you mean by that. I mean personally. Brandon's voice had the pleasant quality still, the too bright quality. She's an attractive woman, successful, smart. I'm just asking if a man in your position has ever thought, I work here, Logan said flatly. That's it. Right, but Brandon leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, and his smile broadened in a way that Logan recognized as the precursor to something worse. We've got a bet going, actually, some of us, about whether someone like you, contractor, quiet guy, no real standing in the company, could ever get close enough to Victoria Hale to even have a conversation that wasn't strictly professional. He paused. I'd go further, but I'm trying to keep it professional. Laughter. Not a lot of it. 3 or 4 people, and uncomfortable laughter, the kind you make when you don't know what else to do. But enough that it filled the silence. Logan's jaw was tight. He could feel it, the muscle jumping just below his ear. He made himself breathe. I don't think that's an appropriate topic, he said. Oh, relax, Pierce. Brandon's tone shifted to faux casual, the performance of a man being misunderstood. It's a question. I'm curious. You've been here 3 years, you keep your head down, you work hard. Don't you ever think about moving up, using an opportunity when it presents itself? No, Logan said. Not like that. Not like what? Not the way you're implying. The silence that followed had a different texture. Brandon's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes did. A sharpening, a recalibration. Noted, Brandon said pleasantly. The meeting ended 2 minutes later. People filed out without making eye contact with Logan. He gathered his laptop and his notepad and walked back to his desk in the bullpen and sat down and stared at his screen for a full minute before he realized he wasn't reading anything. He was thinking about Emma's drawing of the horse in his jacket pocket. He was thinking about good luck and whether it was something you carried or something that found you. And he was thinking that he was very tired and that it was only Tuesday. He didn't think about the meeting for the rest of that day, or he tried not to. He buried himself in the Q3 variance analysis he'd been working on, a genuinely complicated piece of work involving 3 overlapping data sets and a methodology that kept throwing anomalies in the 3rd column. And by the time he packed up his laptop at 6:15, he'd gotten himself into something close to equilibrium. The train home was crowded. He stood for most of it with one hand on the overhead bar, swaying with the motion of the car, watching a woman across the aisle help her toddler with the zipper on a small backpack. The toddler was deeply invested in this zipper. Logan found himself almost smiling. He picked Emma up from the after-school program at the Westfield Community Center, 3 blocks from their building. She came out wearing her coat inside out and carrying a paper plate with what appeared to be a papier-mâché mushroom on it. What's that? He asked. It's a philosophical mushroom, she said with great seriousness. What does that mean? It means I didn't have enough time to paint it, so I called it something that made it sound like it was supposed to be this way. He looked at her for a second. That's either very creative or a life philosophy I'm going to be thinking about for a while. Both, Emma said, and took his hand. They made pasta that night, the quick kind, 20 minutes, jarred sauce improved with garlic, and a handful of spinach, and a lot of Parmesan. Emma told him about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Calla about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs. And Logan listened and weighed in where appropriate and didn't mention Brandon Cross or the conference room or the 11 people sitting in a semicircle, and by the time they were doing the dishes and Emma was humming something tuneless and slightly off-key, the day had receded to a distance where he could manage it. He put Emma to bed at 8:30. They were reading a book about a girl who discovers she can talk to plants, which Emma had strong opinions about, specifically about the scientific inaccuracies, which she delivered with the confidence of someone who had recently watched 2 documentaries about botany and considered herself an authority. Plants don't communicate like that, Emma informed him after he'd read a passage where the protagonist received what was described as a message from an oak tree. It's fiction, Logan said. Fiction should still be internally consistent. He looked at her. 8 years old. Where did you learn the phrase internally consistent? Miss Aldridge says it about our creative writing. Ms. Aldridge sounds demanding. She's amazing, Emma said simply. He kissed her on the forehead. She was asleep by 8:57. He knew because he checked, the way he always checked, standing in the doorway with the hall light behind him, watching her breathe. He sat at the kitchen table afterward with his coffee and his personal laptop and the folder he kept. He opened it and added a line. Conference room meeting, October 14th. Present, B, Cross, Self, and approximately 9 other employees. Public comments. CEO, Victoria Hale, directed at me. Framing of inappropriate bet. Suggestion of using proximity to CEO for personal advancement. Refusal on my part. General humiliation. Laughter from 3 to 4 individuals. He saved the document and closed the laptop. He sat there a while longer in the quiet kitchen, listening to the building settle around him. It was fine. He was fine. He could manage this. 2 days later, he found out about the recording. It came from Priya, one of the junior analysts in the bullpen who'd been in the conference room during the meeting. She was 26 and careful, and she'd never said more than 40 words to Logan in 3 years of working in proximity, which was why it registered as significant when she appeared at his desk at 10:15 on a Thursday morning and placed a coffee cup down next to his keyboard with the deliberate precision of someone putting a document into evidence. "I didn't bring you coffee," she said. He looked at the coffee. "Okay. If anyone asks, I didn't bring you coffee, and we didn't have this conversation." Logan looked up from his screen. Priya was looking at a point slightly to his left, which was the body language equivalent of not being here. "Okay," he said again. "I'm listening." "Brandon had his phone out the whole meeting," she said. "The one on Tuesday. I thought he was texting, but I was sitting at an angle and I could see the screen. He had the voice memo app open." Logan felt his stomach drop about 4 inches. "He was recording," he said. "He was recording from the start, which means he has you on tape saying the thing you said, the refusal thing. But he also has everything he said before it, and if someone edits a recording, you can make it sound like anything you want." "Yeah." Priya picked up the coffee cup she hadn't brought him, turned it in her hands, set it back down. I thought you should know because you seem like someone who documents things." She walked back to her desk without looking at him. Logan sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he opened his personal laptop. He'd started bringing it to work in his bag because there were things he didn't want on the company system, and opened his folder and added a new entry. He wrote it out in full. Everything Priya had told him, the date, the time, the detail about the phone screen and the voice memo app. Then he closed the laptop and looked at his work screen and tried to figure out what to do next. The problem with the recording was that it transformed the calculus entirely. Up until now, the situation had been uncomfortable and demoralizing, and the kind of thing Logan could theoretically report, except that reporting it meant Brandon denying it, and the company choosing between the word of a contractor and the word of a senior manager, which was not a coin flip he felt confident making. But a recording changed that. A recording in Brandon's possession meant that Brandon held the narrative. He could release a version of it, edited, stripped of context, that would make Logan look like the instigator, the inappropriate one, the employee whose conduct needed to be investigated. And then Logan wouldn't be the contractor who'd reported harassment. He'd be the contractor who'd behaved inappropriately toward the CEO and then tried to deflect by making a false complaint. He'd be gone inside a week. He sat at his desk and ran this math until his lunch break, when he went to the small park 2 blocks from the office and sat on a bench and called his sister Renata, who was the only person outside of work he'd told even a fraction of this to. Renata listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She was 3 years older than Logan and had strong opinions about most things, and expressed them freely, but she'd learned over the years that Logan needed space to finish a thought before she could respond to it. "Okay," she said when he'd finished. "First thing, Emma's fine, right? She doesn't know any of this?" "Emma thinks my biggest problem right now is that I don't know how to pick a ripe avocado." "Smart kid." A brief pause. "Logan, you have to go above him." "To who?" "To whoever is above him. To HR. HR is not impartial. HR is the company, Renata." If the company decides this is a he said situation, and one of the he's is a senior manager with a potentially manipulated recording, what about this CEO, Victoria Hale? Logan closed his eyes, sat with the park sounds around him. Pigeons, the distant sound of a leaf blower, two people arguing pleasantly about where to have lunch. I don't know her, he said. You've seen her. In all hands meetings, in a room with 200 people. But you have access to her theoretically. I'm a contractor, Renata. I don't have access to anybody. But she has access to you, right? She's the CEO. She can choose to be aware of anyone in that building. He thought about that. He'd seen Victoria Hale exactly 4 times. Twice in all-hands meetings, once in a hallway encounter where she'd been walking with 2 of her senior advisors and had glanced up from whatever she'd been reading and made brief, direct eye contact with Logan, and then looked away. Once in the parking structure where she'd been on a phone call and he'd been heading to his car, and they'd done the awkward elevator button dance, and she'd said, "After you," and he'd said, "Thank you," and that had been the entirety of their personal exchange in 3 years. She did not know he existed. Let me think about it, he said. Logan? I know. You always say you'll think about it. I always do think about it. Yeah, and then you decide to wait until you have more information, and then you wait, and then... Renata. His voice came out steadier than he felt. I have Emma to think about. It's not just me. A silence. Not a comfortable one. I know, she said quietly. I know that. But, Logan, Emma also needs you to not disappear into yourself. She needs you around in more ways than just financially. He said goodbye and hung up and sat on the bench a while longer, watching the pigeons. That evening, after Emma was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and thought about invisibility. He'd been invisible at Callaway Meridian for 3 years. He'd chosen it mostly. The head down, no waves, do the work approach. It had suited him because the alternative, drawing attention, carried risks he wasn't willing to take when Emma's school year and rent and health insurance were all contingent on his continued employment. But invisibility had its own costs, and he was only now beginning to understand what they were. Being invisible meant Brandon Cross could use him as target practice, without expecting resistance. Being invisible meant that when something happened in that conference room, there were 11 people present, and not a single one of them would be likely to go on record about what they'd witnessed. Being invisible meant that he had 3 years of documented evidence in a folder on his personal laptop, and that folder meant almost nothing because he'd never shown it to anyone. And a document that no one has seen is just a record of all the ways a person chose not to act. He was thinking about that, about action, about its costs, about Emma breathing down the hall, when his phone buzzed with a work email notification. He almost didn't look at it. It was 9:45 and he had a firm rule about work emails after 8. But something made him pick up the phone, some instinct that had been sharpened by several weeks of low-grade alarm. The email was from Brandon Cross. It was sent to Logan and to Logan's direct supervisor, a mid-level manager named Carson Fife, who had the energy of someone who had stopped expecting things to improve. The subject line was Conduct Note, Logan Pierce. Logan opened it. The email was written in the careful, neutral tone that people use when they're building a paper trail. It referenced the Tuesday meeting. It stated that Logan had made comments during the meeting that could be construed as potentially inappropriate in nature regarding senior leadership. It said that Brandon was noting this for the record in the interest of maintaining professional standards. It did not include any specific quotes, which was deliberate. Specific quotes would require context. At the bottom, Brandon had written, I'm available to discuss further if needed. I want to handle this discreetly. Logan read it 3 times. Then he opened his folder and wrote, Email received 9:47 p.m., October 16th. From B. Cross, CC'd to C. Fife. Subject line, Conduct Note, Logan Pierce. Contents, vague allegation of potentially inappropriate comments. No specifics cited. Written in language designed to establish a paper trail while preventing direct refutation. The email is clearly preemptive, designed to create a record that positions me as the problem before I can create one that positions him. He saved the document. He closed the laptop. He sat at his kitchen table in the quiet apartment, 8-year-old daughter asleep down the hall, and felt the walls of his situation narrow around him. But the next morning, a Friday, he went to work and did nothing visible. He answered the emails that needed answering, completed the variance analysis he'd been working on, ate his lunch at his desk. He said good morning to the two colleagues he said good morning to every day, and otherwise kept to his own space, which no one noticed because no one ever noticed. He spent most of the day thinking. Brandon had the recording. Brandon had sent the preemptive email, which meant Brandon was preparing for Logan to report, which meant Brandon was either afraid of what Logan might say, or he was simply the kind of person who enjoyed having the first word in every confrontation and had calculated that this situation was worth locking down. Either way, Logan was now on the record as a problem before he'd done anything to create a problem. The only way out of that was to present something that reframed the narrative entirely. Not a complaint, but a testimony. Not an allegation, but a counter-narrative that had its own evidence, which meant he needed to talk to someone who could actually listen to what he had to say without filtering it through the company's self-protective instincts. He thought about that a long time. Victoria Hale's assistant's email address was publicly listed on the company intranet. Logan had never used it. He'd never had a reason to. But he looked at it that afternoon, at his desk, with the ambient noise of the bullpen around him. Keyboards, a distant phone, someone's muffled music leaking from their earbuds. And he thought about Renata's voice on the phone the day before. She can choose to be aware of anyone in that building. He wasn't going to email the assistant. An email was too easy to intercept, too easy to ignore, too far from the kind of direct communication this situation required. But there was a channel that wasn't the assistant. A channel that existed precisely for situations like this, if he was reading the company's own documentation correctly. Callaway Meridian had a formal mechanism. Any employee, including contractors, could request a 15-minute meeting with executive leadership through the company's open-door policy. It was listed in the employee handbook. It had apparently never been used based on the way the section was written, buried in paragraph 7 of the conduct section in language so corporate and airless it seemed designed to discourage reading. But it existed. Logan read it 3 times to be certain. Then he went back to his analysis and worked until 6 and went home to his daughter and made dinner and helped with her reading homework. She was struggling with one particular chapter, kept losing her place, and they worked through it together at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and Emma's sock feet tucked under her on the chair. And he didn't tell her anything was wrong because she was 8 and nothing was wrong in the ways that mattered to her right now. Later, after she was asleep, he drafted a meeting request. He wrote it and rewrote it 4 times. He kept it short. He stated his name, his position, his contract status. He stated that he was requesting a meeting under the open door policy to discuss a workplace matter. He did not describe the matter. He did not use Brandon's name. He did not attach any documents. He sat with the draft for 20 minutes. Then he sent it. He didn't expect a response. He'd prepared himself for silence, for the possibility that the request would go to an assistant who'd redirect it to HR, which would redirect it into the same machinery he was trying to work around. He'd prepared himself for the possibility that this was a mistake, that he was exposing himself without any guarantee of a fair hearing. He'd prepared himself for all of that. What he had not prepared himself for was the response that arrived 11 minutes later, not from an assistant, but from an address he didn't immediately recognize, and which he had to read twice before he understood who had sent it. Mr. Pierce, I have time Monday at 8 a.m. before the executive meeting cycle begins. My assistant will confirm the room. Come alone. The sender was V. Hale. Logan read the email 4 times. Then he put his phone down, face up on the kitchen table, and sat in the quiet of his apartment for a long time, listening to the building breathe around him, thinking about a lot of things. He was thinking about the folder on his personal laptop. He was thinking about Brandon Cross's preemptive email and the recording and the conference room and the 11 people who'd been sitting in their chairs. He was thinking about Emma, asleep down the hall, who had pressed a drawing of a horse into his hand that morning because she wanted him to have good luck. He was thinking that Monday felt very far away and also very close. He was thinking that he didn't know what kind of woman Victoria Hale was. Not really, not beyond the reputation and the 4 brief glimpses. And that he was about to walk into her office and say things that could not be unsaid, and that the only thing he was truly certain about in this moment was that staying invisible was no longer an option. Not for Emma. Not for himself. He reached out and turned his phone face down on the table. Then he got up, rinsed his coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. He didn't sleep well that weekend. Not terribly, not the kind of sleeplessness that announces itself with staring at the ceiling and watching the minutes change on the clock. More the quiet, unsatisfying kind where you drift in and out of something that looks like rest but doesn't feel like it. Where your brain keeps returning to the same set of problems the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. By Sunday morning, he was up at 5:30 without the alarm, earlier than usual, standing in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn with his coffee and the low hum of the refrigerator and the particular silence of a city that hadn't quite started yet. He thought about the email. He'd read it maybe a dozen times since Friday night, each time looking for some tone he'd missed, some subtext that changed the meaning. He didn't find one. The message was what it was, direct, spare, no warmth but no coldness either. Come alone. He'd been turning those two words over all weekend, trying to decide if they were reassuring or ominous, and had concluded that they were probably neither. They were just practical. Victoria Hale had not built a reputation for theater. What he didn't know, what kept snagging at him between the grocery run on Saturday afternoon and Emma's soccer practice and the hours after dinner when the apartment was quiet and he had nothing to do but think, was what he was actually walking into. He knew what he wanted to say. He'd rehearsed it, not out loud because he couldn't do that with Emma home, but in his head, in the rational, organized way he approached problems at work, the context, the timeline, the conference room incident, the recording. Brandon's preemptive email. The folder. He had a clear sequence and he knew it cold. What he didn't know was what Victoria Hale already knew, or what she thought of him, or whether she'd see a contractor requesting a meeting under the open door policy as something worth her time, or as a minor inconvenience that she'd agreed to out of procedural obligation. He'd Googled her, which felt faintly ridiculous, but he'd done it anyway. The search results were what he expected. Professional profiles, a few business press interviews, a feature in a trade publication from 2 years ago about her restructuring of Callaway Meridian's analytics division. In the interviews, she was precise and somewhat guarded, the way intelligent people are when they're aware that every word has a public life. She didn't give a lot of personal detail. She had a degree in economics from a school he'd heard of, an MBA she'd apparently finished in 18 months, and she'd taken the CEO role at 28 after the previous CEO retired under circumstances the press described as mutual agreement, which everyone in the industry apparently understood to mean something else. Nothing in the search results told him whether she was someone he could trust. That wasn't the kind of information that made it onto the internet. He picked Emma up from her Saturday soccer practice muddy and pleased with herself because her team had won by 2 goals, and she told him about each goal in granular detail. The positioning, who passed to whom, a near miss that she said deserved its own documentary. And Logan listened with genuine attention because this was easy to be present for. This was the part of his life that worked. "You worried about something?" Emma asked in the car on the way home. He glanced at her. She was in the back seat, still in her cleats, picking at a blade of grass that had gotten stuck to her shin guard. "No," he said. "Why?" "You've got the face." "What face?" She scrunched her nose, demonstrating a subtle flattening of expression, eyes slightly unfocused, the look of someone running calculations. "That face. The one you do when you're thinking about something you don't want to talk about." He was quiet for a second. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to me," she said with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had been studying him her entire life. He almost told her. Not the details, not Brandon Cross or recordings or the email, but something, some acknowledgement that she was right and that there was a thing sitting on his chest this weekend, a weight she'd correctly identified. But she was 8, and the weight was his to carry, so he said, "Work thing, nothing serious, I'll figure it out." Emma considered this with the gravity she applied to most things. Is it a person problem or a task problem? What's the difference? Task problems you can just solve. Person problems you have to navigate. She said it the way someone recites something they've been told, and Logan realized with a small shock that she was quoting him, something he must have said at some point that she'd absorbed and filed away. "Person problem," he said. "Those are harder," Emma agreed and went back to picking at the grass on her shin guard. He drove the rest of the way home with the word navigate sitting quietly in his head. But Monday morning arrived the way difficult mornings do. Too fast and too slow at the same time. Logan wide awake before the alarm. The apartment still dark. Emma still asleep. He moved through the routine carefully, which was the only way he knew how to move through things that mattered. Shower, coffee, lunch, packed. He left Emma's breakfast ready on the counter, cereal, sliced banana, a note that said, "Good luck with the math quiz. You've got it," because she had a math quiz today and she'd been anxious about it the way she got anxious about tests, going quiet and overly precise in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of himself. His neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, who was 67 and retired and who had been walking Emma to school on Mondays for the past year, in exchange for Logan fixing her printer every time it broke, which was approximately monthly, arrived at 7:15. Emma was up by then, eating her cereal at the kitchen table with a math worksheet in front of her that she was studying with the focus of someone preparing for a deposition. "You'll be fine," Logan told her, getting his jacket. "You don't know that," Emma said, without looking up. "I know you studied for 3 days." Studying doesn't always mean you know it in the moment. There's a difference between studied knowledge and retrieval under pressure. He stopped, looked at her. "Emma." She looked up. "You've got it," he said. She held his gaze for a second. Then she nodded, once, the way she did when she decided to believe something. "Okay." He said goodbye to Mrs. Callahan, took the stairs, walked 4 blocks to the train station in air that had gone cold overnight, the kind of cold that arrived overnight in October and didn't apologize for itself. On the train, standing again with his hand on the overhead bar, he ran through it one more time. Context, timeline, conference room, recording, email. He knew it clean. He'd print out key pages from the folder when he got to the office, before the meeting, the date-stamped entries, the email from Brandon. He'd bring them in a plain folder, nothing dramatic. He didn't know if it would matter. He didn't know if any of it would matter. But he was going to walk in there and say it plainly because that was the only thing left that was actually in his control. The 22nd floor was different from the rest of the building in the way executive floors always were. Quieter, with better carpet, and the kind of curated silence that money bought. Logan had been up here exactly once before, 2 years ago, for a meeting with a senior director that had been rescheduled 3 times before it finally happened. He remembered the floor mostly as a place where people moved with a particular kind of purposefulness, where every conversation seemed to be happening at a half volume and with full attention. Victoria Hale's assistant, a composed woman named Adele, who looked like she managed crises with the same expression she used to manage calendar invites, met Logan at the elevator at 8 o'clock exactly. She led him down a short hallway to a conference room that wasn't the CEO's office, but was adjacent to it. A room with a glass wall and a table that seated 6 and a view of the city that Logan didn't let himself look at for too long because he needed to be focused. "She'll be right in," Adele said, and left. Logan sat down and placed his folder on the table and folded his hands on top of it and looked at the door. Victoria Hale came in 3 minutes later. She was wearing a dark blazer, and she had a coffee cup in one hand and a phone in the other, and she was reading something on the phone as she came through the door, which she clicked shut behind her with her heel, without looking, the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. She finished reading whatever she was reading, put the phone face down on the table, and sat across from Logan with the directness of someone who didn't have time for the ambient social rituals most people use to open a conversation. "Logan Pierce," she said, not a question. "Contract analyst, analytics division, 3 years. Yes. You requested a meeting under the open door policy." She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were dark and focused and not unfriendly exactly, but not warm either. The eyes of someone who took in information quickly and was currently taking in him. "That section of the handbook gets used approximately never, so I want to be clear that I'm treating this seriously before you say anything." Logan hadn't expected that. He recalibrated slightly. "I appreciate that. What do you want to tell me?" He looked at her for a moment. This woman he'd glimpsed 4 times, who'd built a reputation he'd read about on the internet, who'd responded to his email at 9:58 on a Friday night. Then he opened his folder. "I want to tell you about Brandon Cross," he said. "And I want to tell you all of it, in order, because the sequence matters. I'll be as specific as I can. I have documentation." He touched the folder. I'd like you to hear it before you decide what you think about it." Something shifted in Victoria Hale's expression. Not surprise exactly. More a sharpening of attention, a quality of focus that was different from the professional default focus she'd come in with. "Okay," she said. "Tell me." So Logan told her. He told her about the first incident, 4 months in, the comment about volume and value in the meeting. He told her about the pattern that followed, the Friday afternoon assignments, the public questioning of his work, the CT'd emails. He told her about the conference room meeting on October 14th, and he described it in specific detail. What Brandon had said, how he'd said it, the room's response. He told her what Priya had seen on Brandon's phone screen. He told her about the email Brandon had sent at 9:47 on a Friday night, using language careful enough to be deniable, but clear enough in its intent. He told it plainly, without drama, because drama would have felt like a concession. These were facts, and he documented them, and he said them the way you say things that are simply true. Victoria did not interrupt him. She held her coffee cup in both hands and she listened, and whatever she was thinking moved behind her eyes without surfacing, and Logan was aware, in the peripheral way that he was aware of most things, that this was a woman who was good at holding things in while she was deciding what to do with them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The email he sent you Friday," she said. "Do you have it?" He handed over the printed copy. She read it. Her expression didn't change, but there was something in the set of her mouth that hadn't been there before. "He copied Carson Fife," she said. "Yes." Carson Fife wouldn't have known what to do with this. It wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. He'd have sat on it hoping it resolved itself. Logan said nothing, because that was probably accurate. Victoria set the email down and looked at him. "You said you have entries in this folder going back to shortly after you joined. 3 years of them, date stamped. I can provide copies of everything. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." She held his gaze. "Why now? You've been documenting this for 3 years and you didn't report it. What changed?" The question was fair. Logan had known it was coming, or something like it, and he'd thought about it on the train, and he gave her the answer that was true, rather than the answer that sounded better. "The recording changed it," he said. "As long as it was my word against his, I calculated that the risk of reporting outweighed the risk of staying quiet. That's a calculation I made because I'm a contractor and I don't have the protections a permanent employee has, and because I have a daughter and her stability depends on my income." He paused. "I'm not proud of that calculation, but it's the one I made." "And now?" "Now he has a recording that he can edit. Which means my staying quiet doesn't protect me anymore. It just means he controls the narrative, and I have no counter to it." He looked at her steadily. "I'd rather tell the truth in a situation where the truth might not be believed than stay silent in a situation where silence definitely won't protect me." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "How often does Emma have a math quiz?" Logan blinked. "What?" "You mentioned a daughter, Emma. You said she had a math quiz today." The faintest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening at the edge. "I'm asking how often she has one, because I'm trying to understand how seriously you take showing up to things that matter to you." He understood what she was really asking. "She has a quiz every other week. I've never missed picking her up from school." "Not once?" "Not once in 3 years." Victoria nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that Logan had not expected and would turn over in his mind for a long time afterward. "Brandon Cross has been on my radar for 6 months, she said. Logan went very still. "I became aware of a pattern approximately 6 months ago, not involving you specifically, but involving other members of the analytics division and one member of the operations team." She spoke carefully, in the tone of someone choosing words with purpose. "I have been gathering information, quietly, through channels that don't tip him off, because people like Brandon Cross are very good at managing up, and the moment they know they're being watched, they become even better at it." Logan absorbed this. "You were already building a file, yes. Why didn't you act sooner?" She set down her coffee. "Because I needed to be certain. I needed a pattern that was documented from multiple sources, not a single complaint I couldn't substantiate. One complaint, and Brandon would have neutralized it, and then whoever made it would have found themselves in a very difficult position. She looked at him directly. Which is what he's trying to do to you right now with the email. Logan felt something in his chest that was a complicated mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that he was being heard. Frustration that he'd carried the last 3 years alone, when apparently there had been movement somewhere above him that he'd had no way to know about. So what happens now? He asked. Now I need the folder. She nodded at the documents on the table. Everything in it, copies, keep your originals, and I need the name of the person who told you about the recording. Priya. He stopped. I don't want her to get pulled into this in a way that I won't expose her. I need to know who to protect. Victoria's voice was level. There's a difference between a witness and a target. He looked at her. She was 30 years old and she was the CEO of a company that employed several hundred people, and she was sitting across from him in a conference room at 8:15 in the morning, having apparently spent 6 months quietly building a case against a senior manager, and she'd responded to his email on a Friday night in 11 minutes. Okay, he said. Her last name is Mehta. Victoria wrote it down on the notepad beside her coffee. I need a few days, she said. I want you to go back to your desk today and work normally. Don't change anything about your routine. Don't avoid Brandon. Don't give him any indication that this conversation happened. Can you do that? Logan thought about the 3 years he'd been doing exactly that, keeping his face neutral, his head down, his work excellent. Yes, he said, I can do that. If he contacts you again, email, in person, anything beyond standard professional communication, document it immediately and forward it to Adele with the subject line, October file. She'll know what it means. He nodded. Victoria picked up her phone and stood, which was the universal signal that a meeting was ending. Logan gathered his folder and stood as well. He was almost to the door when she said his name. Not Mr. Pierce, just Logan, which surprised him enough that he turned. You said you made a calculation, she said, about the risk of staying quiet versus reporting. I want you to know that calculation was reasonable given your position. Anyone in your situation would have made the same one. She held his gaze. But I'm glad you came up anyway. Logan didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there was anything that fit. He nodded once, opened the conference room door, and walked back to the elevator. On the way down, he stood in the elevator alone and watched the floor numbers change and thought about the word reasonable. How rarely anyone had offered him that in the last 3 years. How much it cost to hold all of that quietly for that long. And how strange it was that what you needed sometimes wasn't rescue, but just someone confirming, simply and without ceremony, that you hadn't been wrong to carry it the way you had. He got back to his desk at 8:37. He opened his work laptop. He pulled up the Q3 variance analysis and began reviewing where he'd left off. At the far end of the bullpen, Priya was at her desk with her headphones in. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. At 11:45, Brandon Cross came downstairs. Logan heard him before he saw him. That specific quality of footfall, the changed air pressure of someone who took up room. He didn't look up from his screen. He kept his eyes on the third column of data he'd been checking, the one that kept throwing the anomaly, and he made his expression blank in the way he'd learned to make it blank over 3 years. Brandon stopped at the edge of the bullpen. Logan could feel it, the pause, the positioning, without looking. Pierce, Brandon said. Logan looked up. Yeah. Good weekend? Fine, thanks. Brandon studied him with the pleasant expression that wasn't pleasant. Heard you've been putting in some extra hours on the Q3 report. Just finishing up. Good man. The pleasantness of his smile had a specific quality today, tighter, more careful, the smile of someone who was checking for something without wanting to appear to be checking. Let me know if you need anything. Will do, Logan said. Brandon moved on. Logan looked back at his screen. The third column anomaly resolved itself 20 minutes later. It had been a labeling error in the source data, a transposed digit that had cascaded through the calculation. Simple, once you found it. The kind of thing that looked complicated from a distance and then turned out to have a completely unglamorous explanation. Logan fixed it, saved the file, and moved to the next task. He worked until 6. He packed up his bag, said a general good evening to the bullpen, and took the elevator down. He walked the 4 blocks to the train station in the same cold air as that morning and rode home and picked up Emma from Mrs. Callahan, who reported that Emma had come home from school in a very good mood. "The quiz?" Logan asked. "Apparently she destroyed it," Mrs. Callahan said, with the satisfied air of someone who'd been rooting for this outcome. Emma, from the couch, did not look up from her book but said, "I prefer the word mastered. Destroying implies aggression." Logan leaned in the doorway of his own living room and looked at his daughter, who was reading with her sock feet tucked under her and her hair escaping from its ponytail in 4 different directions, and felt something in him settle. "Mastered," he agreed. He made dinner. They ate. He helped Emma with a book report she was starting. She'd chosen a book about a girl who traveled by hot air balloon, which she'd picked because she said it had the best cover art she'd ever seen, and she stood by that as a selection criterion. They worked at the kitchen table under the overhead light, and Logan helped her build the outline, and Emma argued with 2 of his suggestions and was right about one of them, which he acknowledged. That night, after Emma was in bed, Logan sat at the kitchen table and added one final entry to his folder. He wrote the date. He wrote, "Reported to V. Hale directly. Meeting at 8 a.m. Documents provided. Priya Mehta's name provided as witness to recording. Told to continue normal routine. No indication yet of how this will proceed." He paused, and then he added one more line. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I told the truth to the right person." He saved the document. He closed the laptop. Outside, the city had gone quiet the way cities go quiet late on a Monday in October. Not silent, but muffled, the sound turned down to something manageable. Logan sat in his kitchen and drank the last of his coffee, which had gone cold, and thought about Brandon Cross coming through the bullpen today with his careful smile, checking the temperature, not knowing yet what had already shifted. He thought about Victoria Hale writing Priya Mehta's name on a notepad. He thought about Emma saying, "mastered." He went to bed at 10:30 and slept, if not well, then better than he had in a long time. The few days Victoria had asked for stretched into a week and a half, and Logan spent most of it doing exactly what she'd told him to do, working normally, maintaining his routine, giving Brandon Cross no reason to believe anything had changed. It was harder than it sounded. Not because of Brandon, who'd settled back into his usual pattern after that Monday bullpen check. Present, watchful, occasionally loud, directing his particular brand of attention at other people in the division when Logan proved unreactive. But because Logan was waiting, and waiting was something he'd never been good at. He was a person who dealt with problems by working them, by building documentation and running scenarios and moving through the steps of a plan, and right now the plan had passed out of his hands entirely and into someone else's. And all he could do was show up every morning and be invisible, and trust that the machinery he'd set in motion was still moving. He wasn't sure he was good at trust either. Renata called him on a Wednesday evening, 6 days after the Monday meeting. Emma was in her room, allegedly doing homework, but based on the occasional sound of her talking to herself, likely narrating some elaborate game involving her collection of small painted stones. "Well?" Renata said, skipping hello. "Well, what?" "Don't do that. What happened with the CEO?" "I told her everything. She's handling it." A pause. "That's it? She's handling it?" "She said she'd been building a file on Brandon for 6 months already. She wanted my documentation. She told me to keep working normally." Renata was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. Then, "Do you trust her?" Logan had been thinking about that exact question for 6 days. He turned it over the way he turned over complicated data problems, looking for the anomaly, the thing that didn't track. He kept coming back to the same answer. "I think so," he said. "She didn't try to reassure me. She didn't tell me everything was going to be fine. She just told me what she needed and what she was going to do with it." "That's not the same as trusting her." "No," he said, "but it's the closest I can get right now." Renata accepted this, reluctantly. She asked about Emma, and Logan told her about the math quiz and the book report on the hot air balloon book, and by the time they hung up it was past 8 and Emma had gone suspiciously quiet, which Logan had learned to interpret as either sleep or intense concentration. And when he checked it was sleep, she'd fallen asleep on top of her homework, one hand still loosely holding a pencil. He carried her to bed. She didn't wake up, which meant she was genuinely exhausted, and he stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark and thought about Renata's question. Do you trust her? He didn't know. He knew he'd made the only move available to him and that it had landed somewhere, and that somewhere was better than the nowhere he'd been occupying for 3 years. That would have to be enough for now. Brandon's complaint arrived on a Thursday. Logan found out about it the way people usually found out about things that were happening to them at corporate levels they couldn't see, indirectly through the texture of the day changing. Carson Fife, his direct supervisor, appeared at his desk at 2:15 with the constrained expression of someone who'd been given a task they'd rather not perform and had decided to perform it with maximum procedural neutrality. I need you to come with me, Carson said. What's this about? HR wants to speak with you. The HR department at Callaway Meridian occupied a suite of offices on the 8th floor that Logan had been to exactly once for his initial contract onboarding. He walked there now with Carson slightly ahead of him and the specific quality of silence that accompanied office situations where everyone who saw you knew something was happening and no one said anything. The HR director was a woman named Sandra Yee, mid-50s, with the careful professional neutrality of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where people said things they couldn't take back. She had a conference room reserved, smaller than the one on the 22nd floor, no view, a table that seated 4 with documents already on it. Mr. Pierce, Sandra said, please sit down. Logan sat. Carson sat to his right and slightly back, the body language of someone who was present without being part of this. We've received a formal complaint, Sandra said, regarding conduct in the workplace. The complaint names you specifically. She slid a document across the table. You have the right to read this before we discuss it. Logan picked it up. It was Brandon's complaint. 3 pages, formally written, citing a pattern of what it described as inappropriate conduct directed towards senior leadership. It referenced the October 14th meeting, naturally, but had rotated it entirely. In Brandon's version, Logan had made unsolicited comments about the CEO during the meeting that Brandon had found it necessary to redirect. It cited the voice recording as supporting evidence. It stated that Brandon had documented this in good faith through a conduct note, the 9:47 Friday email, and that Logan had subsequently engaged in what the complaint called a pattern of targeted hostility toward the reporting party. Logan read it twice. His jaw was tight. He set it down on the table. This is fabricated, he said. Not heated, just flat. The sequence here is inverted. Brandon Cross initiated the comments about Ms. Hale in the October 14th meeting. I refused. He then sent the conduct note as a preemptive measure because he anticipated I would report him. Sandra's expression was professionally non-committal. That's a significant counter-allegation, Mr. Pierce. I'm aware. I have documentation. What kind of documentation? 3 years of dated entries, the conduct note email, a witness account of the recording being made. Logan looked at her steadily. I've already presented this documentation to Ms. Hale directly. Something changed in Sandra's posture. Subtle, a slight recalibration. You met with Ms. Hale? Monday of last week, 8 a.m. I requested the meeting through the open door policy. Carson, to Logan's right, had gone very still. Sandra wrote something on the notepad in front of her. She was quiet for a moment. I'll need to verify that meeting took place before we proceed. Adele can confirm it, Ms. Hale's assistant. Right. Sandra clicked her pen. Mr. Pierce, I want to be transparent with you. This complaint has been filed formally, which means we're obligated to conduct an investigation regardless of its ultimate merit. That process takes time, and it involves interviews with multiple parties. During that time, I'd ask that you maintain your standard professional conduct and refrain from... I've been maintaining my standard professional conduct for 3 years, Logan said. That's been the consistent feature of this situation on my end. I'd like that noted. Sandra looked at him. Then she nodded, once, and wrote something else. The meeting ended 20 minutes later without resolution, which was how HR meetings ended. Logan walked back to the bullpen with Carson, who had said approximately 9 words during the entire proceeding, and now walked with the compressed energy of someone who wanted to be elsewhere. At the elevator, Carson said, "I didn't know about the meeting with Ms. Hale." "No," Logan said. "You weren't meant to." Carson looked at him, and for a moment his professional neutrality cracked enough to let through something that might have been respect, or might have been guilt, or might have been both at the same time. Then the elevator arrived, and he got on it, and the doors closed, and Logan was alone in the hallway. He stood there for a second. Then he took out his phone and sent an email to Adele with the subject line, "October file," and 3 words in the body. "Formal complaint filed." He put his phone in his pocket and went back to his desk. The investigation was announced the following Monday morning by Sandra Yee via a company-wide email that was carefully worded enough that most people reading it would understand something significant was happening without understanding specifically what. It cited a formal review of conduct within the analytics division and noted that all employees might be contacted for interviews. The bullpen's response to this email was immediate and visible. People glanced at each other over their monitors. Someone got up to get coffee and came back with the particular expressionlessness of someone who'd just exchanged significant looks in the break room. Priya, 2 desks over, kept her eyes on her screen and her headphones on, but Logan noticed her shoulders were very slightly elevated, the body language equivalent of bracing. He was at his desk at 10:15 when Adele called his desk phone, not his cell, his desk phone, which almost no one used, and told him that Miss Hale would like him to come to the 22nd floor at 2 o'clock. He was there at 1:58. Victoria was in her actual office this time, not the adjacent conference room, which Logan registered as a shift of some kind without being sure what it meant. The office was larger than he'd expected and less curated. There were files on the desk in a way that suggested actual use rather than performance. A whiteboard along one wall covered in handwriting that he couldn't read from where he was. 2 chairs in front of the desk that looked like they'd been pulled from elsewhere because they didn't match the desk's aesthetic. She was on the phone when he came in, and she held up one finger without looking at him, 1 minute, and finished the call with her back slightly to him, looking at the whiteboard. "Right. Tell legal I need the full review by Wednesday, not Thursday. Wednesday is already late." A pause. "Then move the Thursday meeting. I'll sort it." She hung up and turned around. She looked tired. Not dramatically. Not the kind of tired that made it into people's faces, but the kind that lived around the eyes of people who hadn't been sleeping cleanly, which Logan recognized because he'd been wearing the same look himself for the past week. "Sit," she said. He sat. She sat across from him, not behind the desk but in the second mismatched chair, which put them at the same level, and he thought that was probably deliberate. "He filed it Thursday afternoon," she said. "You already knew that." Sandra Yee's office. "Right. I reviewed the complaint Friday morning." She had a copy of it on the small table between their chairs, and she set her hand flat on it without opening it, as if the physical gesture was enough. "It's a sophisticated document. He had legal help with it, or someone with legal instincts. The language is constructed to raise questions without making falsifiable claims. Everything is framed as concerns, impressions, patterns he observed, not direct statements that can be directly refuted." "I noticed that," Logan said. He also submitted the audio recording through formal channels on Friday afternoon. It came to Sandra's office. Victoria looked at him. "We've listened to it." Logan's stomach tightened. "And?" "It's been edited." She said it flatly, without drama, the way you state a thing that is simply true. Not heavily. He was careful. "But there are 2 cuts in it. One removes approximately 90 seconds from the beginning of the sequence that includes his initial comments about me. The second removes your exact refusal and replaces the silence around it with a slightly different ambient track." Logan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, she was still watching him. "So, on the recording as submitted," he said, it sounds like you brought up the topic, and then there's a gap, and then there's your voice saying, 'I work here, that's it,' which, without the preceding context, sounds like someone trying to deflect from a comment they've already made." Logan sat with that for a moment. The particular nausea of hearing described, precisely, the version of events that had been constructed to replace the actual one. "Okay," he said. "I said we've listened to it," Victoria said. "I want to be specific about who he is. I listened to it with our general counsel and with the head of building security, because we pulled the conference room's own audio." Logan looked at her. Every conference room in this building has a security microphone, she said. They're not for surveillance in the usual sense. They're installed for emergency safety purposes, and accessing them for anything else requires executive authorization and legal review. I started that authorization process the morning after you and I met. She paused. The building's audio from October 14th is complete and unedited. It has the whole sequence. Logan felt the thing in his chest that had been constricted for 2.5 weeks loosen slightly, a cable under tension finding a fraction of slack. You already had it before he filed the complaint, he said. I had it in review. My general counsel finished the legal analysis Saturday. She looked at him with the direct measuring quality she'd had in their first meeting. Logan, the investigation that Sandra announced this morning is real. We still have to run the full process, but the outcome of that investigation is not going to depend on his word against yours. He said nothing for a moment. Then, what happens in the investigation? Interviews, multiple people in the analytics division, including several who were in the conference room that day. Sandra will run it independently of me. I've already recused myself from the findings process because I have to. She leaned forward slightly. But I want you to understand something. Recusing myself from the process doesn't mean I'm recusing myself from knowing what's right. I'm not going to sit on evidence. How long? The formal process? A week, maybe 10 days if people are slow to schedule. She looked at the copy of Brandon's complaint under her hand. He's going to be called in for an interview. When he finds out we have the building audio, it'll become clear to him that the edited recording doesn't help him the way he intended. What does that do to someone like him? Logan asked. Not rhetorically. He genuinely wanted to know. He'd spent 3 years thinking about the machinery of Brandon Cross, and he still didn't fully understand how it processed failure. Victoria considered the question with more seriousness than he'd expected. Someone like Brandon doesn't process exposure the way most people do, she said slowly. Most people, when they realize a situation is going badly, start thinking about damage control. Brandon will start thinking about attack. He'll escalate, make additional allegations, try to pull in other variables, create enough noise that the investigation becomes about managing competing claims rather than establishing facts. She paused. Which is why the building audio matters so much. It removes the ambiguity he needs to operate. Logan thought about this. You've dealt with people like him before. I've dealt with one other, seriously, before this. At a previous company. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a memory, but the shadow of one. I handled it badly, the first time. I waited too long because I wasn't certain, and in the meantime, 3 people left the company and one of them filed an external complaint that cost the organization more than I want to think about. She looked at him. I don't make the same mistake twice. Logan nodded slowly. Go back to your desk, she said. You'll be contacted by Sandra's office for your formal interview, probably in the next 48 hours. Tell them exactly what you told me. Bring your folder. Answer every question specifically and without editorializing. Okay? And Logan. She stood, which meant the meeting was ending. If at any point during this process something happens that feels off, another email, a conversation, anything, send it to Adele immediately. I will. He was at the door when she said, How did the math quiz go? He turned. She was standing behind the mismatched chair with both hands on its back, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite the measured professional attention she'd maintained across 2 meetings. Something more human, more genuinely curious. He told her about Emma's quiz in passing, a detail he'd mentioned while explaining why he'd left Emma's breakfast ready that Monday morning, and he hadn't expected her to have retained it. She said she mastered it, he said. Victoria smiled, a real one, brief, that changed her face more than he'd anticipated. Good, she said. He took the elevator down. His interview with Sandra Yee happened the following Wednesday. It lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes, which was longer than Logan had prepared for, and covered the full 3-year timeline in methodical, careful detail. Sandra had another HR team member present who took notes. Logan had his folder, and he referred to it throughout, citing specific dates and entries, and at one point Sandra asked him to walk her through the October 14th meeting moment by moment, which he did. Not because he was performing thoroughness, but because he'd replayed it enough times in the past 3 weeks that it was simply there, available, the way anything gets available when you carry it long enough. Toward the end of the interview, Sandra asked him something he hadn't fully anticipated. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "in your documentation, you note that you chose not to report this situation to HR for approximately 3 years. Can you help me understand that decision?" It was the same question Victoria had asked, essentially, but with a different weight behind it. Sandra was asking on behalf of the company's process, which meant the answer would go into the record. "Yes," Logan said. "I'm a contractor. I have no permanent employment status and no formal grievance protections beyond what the open door policy provides. At any point in the last 3 years, a complaint from me against a senior manager could have resulted in the termination of my contract on grounds that had nothing to do with the complaint. That's not a hypothetical. That's a structural reality of contract employment." Sandra wrote something. Her pen didn't stop moving for a moment. "I want that in the record," Logan said. "Not as an accusation against the company, as context. Because if this situation is going to be useful to anyone else in my position, it has to be clear that the structure itself was the barrier, not just this one instance." Sandra looked at him over her notepad. "That's a fair point to make," she said, which was the most unguarded thing she'd said in 2 hours and 20 minutes. The interview ended. Logan went back to his desk and worked the rest of the afternoon and went home and picked up Emma and made dinner and told her nothing. That evening, while Emma was in the bath, he sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets and called Renata and told her how the interview had gone. "You told them it was a structural problem," Renata said. "Yeah." "Logan." Her voice was careful. "Do you think they'll actually change anything?" "I don't know." He thought about Victoria Hale saying, "I don't make the same mistake twice." "I think she will." "The CEO." "Yeah." A long pause. "You trust her?" It wasn't a question this time. Logan sat on his kitchen floor and listened to Emma splashing down the hall and thought about all the things he'd carried for 3 years and what it meant to finally put something down. "I think I do," he said. Brandon Cross was called in for his interview on a Friday. Logan knew because Priya, who had been interviewed herself on Thursday, a fact she'd communicated to Logan by placing a coffee cup on his desk in the same wordless way she'd done the first time, which he'd understood to mean "I told them what I saw." Priya told him in a low voice, without looking at him, that she'd seen Brandon go up to the 8th floor at 9 in the morning in his best suit with the expression of someone who was absolutely certain they were going to win. "That expression," Logan said quietly. "Yeah," Priya said. Brandon was in that interview for over 3 hours. The length of it was information. When someone expects to walk in and establish a narrative and walk out in 45 minutes, 3 hours means the narrative has encountered resistance. He came back through the bullpen at 12:30. He wasn't wearing the good suit anymore. He'd taken the jacket off and was carrying it, which on Brandon was the equivalent of a visible crack. He didn't speak to anyone. He went up the stairs to his office and closed the door. The door stayed closed for the rest of the afternoon. Logan worked on the Q4 projection model that Carson had assigned him that week. He checked his work twice, caught a minor error in the second quarter's adjusted baseline, corrected it. He ate his lunch at his desk. He kept his face neutral and his eyes on his screen. At 4:50, a calendar invite appeared on his work computer. The subject was all hands. Analytics division, the time was Monday morning at 9, and it was sent by Sandra Yee. Logan looked at the invite for a long moment. Then he accepted it and went back to the Q4 model. He stayed until 6, packing up his laptop with the methodical care he always used, tucking Emma's latest drawing, a detailed portrait of what she'd described as a wolf who has made questionable choices but is trying, into the front pocket of his bag where he kept the drawings she gave him. He took the elevator down and walked through the lobby and out into the evening, the October air colder now, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet. He walked 2 blocks before he stopped and stood on the sidewalk, people moving around him in the end-of-day current, and let himself feel it, the weight of the week, the interviews, the 2 meetings on the 22nd floor, the 3 years before all of it, all the mornings he'd gotten up and packed Emma's lunch and made himself invisible and told himself it was workable. It had been workable. And it had also cost him, in ways he was only now beginning to count. He stood there for another moment. Then he straightened his bag on his shoulder, turned toward the train station, and walked on. The Monday all-hands meeting started at 9 and ended at 9:47, which was how Logan knew it had not gone the way Brandon Cross had planned for it to go. Sandra Yee ran the meeting with the contained efficiency of someone who had prepared every word carefully and intended to deliver exactly those words and no others. She stood at the front of the Analytics Division conference room, the same room where the October 14th meeting had taken place, which Logan registered as either coincidental or deliberate and couldn't decide which, and addressed the division with the professional neutrality she'd maintained throughout the investigation, giving nothing away in her tone that wasn't already in the words. The investigation had concluded. The findings had been reviewed by HR leadership and by the executive team. The company had determined that conduct violations had occurred within the division at the senior management level. Those violations had included the creation of a hostile work environment, the misuse of company recording equipment, and the submission of materially misleading documentation during the investigation process. Appropriate action had been taken. Brandon Cross was no longer with the company effective that morning. There would be an interim management structure while a permanent replacement was identified. The company's conduct policies would be reviewed and updated. If anyone had concerns or questions, Sandra's door was open. That was it, 9:47. People filed out mostly in silence, the way they file out of rooms where something significant has just been confirmed, where the thing everyone has been quietly tracking for weeks has finally been named out loud. Logan walked back to the bullpen. He sat at his desk. He opened his laptop and looked at the Q4 projection model he'd been working on and realized he wasn't reading it at all, was just looking at the shapes of the numbers without processing them. And he closed the laptop and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk and let the last 3 weeks catch up to him all at once. It didn't feel like victory. He'd thought it might, in the abstract, in the weeks when he was rehearsing scenarios in his head on the train to work, but sitting in the bullpen now with the hum of the office around him and the actual outcome where he'd imagined it would be, what he felt was closer to exhaustion than triumph. The particular exhaustion of a long tension finally releasing, of a body learning it can stop bracing. Priya appeared at the edge of his desk. She wasn't looking at him, technically. She was looking at a point near his shoulder in the way she always communicated sideways, but she'd clearly come over with intention. "You okay?" she said. "Yeah," Logan said. "You?" She considered the question, which was more consideration than it usually got. "I gave my interview and told them exactly what I saw. That's the part I was in control of." She picked up a pen from his desk, turned it in her hand, set it back. "The rest of it is the rest of it." "The rest of it worked out," Logan said. "This time," she said, which wasn't pessimism so much as the accurate assessment of someone who'd been in enough workplaces to know that outcomes weren't guaranteed. Then she went back to her desk. Logan opened his laptop again. This time he read the numbers. The attention started that afternoon. It was subtle at first, the kind of attention that expressed itself in pauses when he walked into a room, in the way people's conversation shifted slightly when he was within earshot, in a kind of careful regard that he didn't know what to do with and hadn't asked for. He understood it, intellectually. Brandon Cross had been visible, had been the kind of presence whose removal created a vacuum, and people needed somewhere to put their understanding of what had happened. Logan was the legible part of the story. He didn't like it. He'd been invisible for 3 years by choice, and the sudden visibility felt like wearing someone else's clothes. Not quite wrong, not quite right, fundamentally not him. Carson Fife stopped by his desk on Tuesday morning, which was notable because Carson had spoken to Logan approximately 4 times in the past year outside of assigned work tasks, and this was a 5th. "I wanted to say," Carson said, and then appeared to reconsider what he wanted to say. "The right thing happened. There were things I probably should have looked at more carefully, over time." Logan looked at him. Carson was 44 and had the energy of someone who'd stopped fighting currents he didn't think he could change, which was its own kind of exhaustion. Logan didn't know what he'd done or not done across the years Brandon had been in that office, but he could see that Carson knew and that knowing sat on him. "I appreciate that," Logan said. He meant it plainly, without subtext. Carson nodded and went back to his office. It wasn't a resolution exactly, but it was something. The harder thing came 3 days later when Logan was called back to the 22nd floor. It wasn't Victoria this time. It was Marcus Ellery, the company's head of operations, who Logan knew by name and reputation and had never spoken to directly. Marcus was 52, silver-haired, one of the few people in Callaway Meridian's leadership who'd been there before Victoria arrived. He had the manner of someone who'd spent decades in large organizations and understood their rhythms the way someone understood weather, not because they could control it, but because they'd learned to read it. He met Logan in the same conference room off Victoria's office and shook his hand and offered coffee and said all of the things you said in a situation like this: the investigation, the findings, the company's commitment to a different kind of workplace. And Logan listened politely and waited for the part that wasn't script. It came about 15 minutes in. "There's going to be some awkwardness," Marcus said, setting down his coffee cup. "I want to be honest with you about that. The investigation is concluded, but the story of it isn't. People in this company now know your name in connection with this situation, and that has implications." "I know," Logan said. "The company is committed to ensuring that your contract status doesn't disadvantage you in any ongoing way. We'd like to discuss the possibility of a permanent position." Logan had been expecting something like this. He'd had the conversation with himself already, sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets, and he knew what he was going to say before Marcus finished the sentence. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'd like some time to think about it." Marcus nodded. "Of course. There's no pressure." He paused. "Can I ask what you're weighing?" Logan thought about how to say it. "When I became the story," he said carefully, "instead of just the person who reported the problem, this company stopped being a place I could work invisibly. I've been invisible here for 3 years. That was the arrangement. Not official, but functional. It suited me because it let me do my job and leave at 6 and be where I needed to be." He looked at Marcus. "A permanent role here, at this point, means being visible in a way I didn't choose and can't fully manage. I need to think about whether that works for me." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's a more honest answer than most people would give." "I'm trying to be honest about what I need," Logan said. "That seems like the least I can do at this point." He shook Marcus's hand and went back to his desk and worked the rest of the afternoon. And when he left at 6, the air outside had turned genuinely cold. The November kind of cold that didn't apologize or offer to be anything else. And he walked to the train with his hands in his pockets, thinking about visibility and what it cost. He talked to Emma about it on a Saturday, which was unusual because he'd made a practice of not bringing work into their weekend time. But Emma was eating cereal at the kitchen table, and Logan had his coffee, and the morning was quiet and unhurried, and she looked up at him with the particular expression she had when she could tell he had something on his mind, and he decided it was time. Not the specifics, not Brandon or recordings or HR investigations or the 22nd floor, but the shape of the decision. "I'm trying to figure out whether to stay at my job," he said. Emma put her spoon down. She gave this her full attention, which she didn't always do. Sometimes when he talked, she was 3/4 present and 1/4 somewhere else, some internal narrative she was composing, but right now she was all the way here. "Why might you leave?" she said. "Because something happened at work, and it changed things there in a way that makes it harder to do my job the way I was doing it. And a different place might let me do it better." "Different how?" "More time. Less—" He thought about how to say it. "Less complicated." Emma considered this with the gravity she applied to most things. "Would we have to move?" "No, different office, same city." "Would you make less money?" He looked at her. "Probably a little, for a while." "I don't need a lot," Emma said. "I mostly need lunch and books, and you to be home at a normal time." Logan was quiet for a moment. "You'd actually be home more?" Emma pressed. "Probably yes." She picked up her spoon and went back to her cereal. "I think you should go," she said. Decisive, matter-of-fact the way she was when she'd reached a conclusion and saw no reason to dress it up. "You barely thought about it," Logan said. "I thought about it enough." She took a bite of cereal. "You have the face less when you have more time. I like it when you have the face less." He sat with that across the kitchen table, his 8-year-old daughter and her cereal and her complete lack of interest in complicating simple things, and felt something in his chest settle into a shape he recognized as right. He spent most of that weekend making calls. his former professor from his graduate program, who'd been a reference for him when he joined Callaway Meridian and who still occasionally forwarded him things of interest. A former colleague at a company he'd consulted for 2 years before Callaway Meridian, who'd mentioned in a LinkedIn message 6 months ago that they were expanding their analytics team. An old friend who now worked in talent placement and who owed him a favor going back to a move Logan had helped him with 3 years ago involving a rental truck and 4 flights of stairs. By Sunday evening, he had 2 conversations scheduled for the following week. He hadn't resigned. He wasn't going to resign until something concrete replaced the income. He wasn't stupid or impulsive, and Emma's lunch and the rent were not abstract concerns. But he'd put the motion in place, the first steps of a process that had its own momentum now, and sitting at the kitchen table Sunday night after Emma was in bed, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, exactly. More like direction. The specific quality of knowing which way you're facing. Itchem. The conversation with Victoria came on a Wednesday of the following week. He hadn't requested it. The calendar invite arrived from Adele. Meeting request. V. Hale. 20 minutes. 4 p.m. And Logan had looked at it for a moment before accepting. He'd wondered if this was the company following up on Marcus's conversation, another attempt to make the permanent position compelling. He'd prepared himself for that, or something like it. He wasn't prepared for what it actually was. Victoria's office had the same lived-in quality as before, so papers on the desk, the whiteboard with handwriting that had changed since his last visit, but was still too distant to read, the 2 mismatched chairs. She was at her desk when he came in, and she came around the desk to the chairs the way she had last time, which he decided was definitely deliberate, a small architectural choice she made about where power sat in a conversation. She looked better rested than she had 3 weeks ago. Whatever she'd been carrying through the investigation had redistributed itself somehow. "How are you doing?" she said. No preamble. "Honestly? Please. I'm tired in a way that's going to take a while to work through. But it's the right kind of tired." He considered. Like after a hard week where the work actually meant something. She nodded. "Marcus talked to you?" "Last week. He told me what you said about visibility." She held his gaze. "He also told me you asked for time to think about it." "I did." "And?" Logan had been waiting for this question, had known it was coming somewhere in this conversation, and he'd decided on the train over that he wasn't going to soften it. "I'm going to leave," he said. "Not immediately. I'm not going to walk out without appropriate notice, and I'll complete whatever's on my plate before I go. But I've been in conversations with another company, and I think it's the right move." Victoria was quiet. Her expression didn't crack, but there was something in it, something that might have been disappointment, or might have been respect, or might have been both occupying the same space. "Because of the visibility," she said. "Partly. And partly because Emma needs more of my time than this place allows. And the situation this fall made it clear to me that I'd been tolerating conditions here that I shouldn't have been tolerating for 3 years. That's not an accusation against the company." "It's accurate, though," Victoria said. "The structural conditions you described to Sandra, the contract status, the absence of protection, that's accurate. We're changing it, but we're changing it now. Not 3 years ago when you needed it." Logan looked at her. "I know. I'm not trying to keep you from going," she said. "I want to be clear about that. What you decide about your career isn't my business, and I'm not going to make an argument about what the company can offer you that would feel inappropriate given everything." She paused. "I just wanted to have this conversation directly, not through Marcus, not through HR. I thought you deserved that." "I appreciate it," Logan said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that he hadn't expected. "Can I tell you something that isn't about business?" He looked at her. "Yeah." "When you came into that first meeting," she said, "with your folder and your 3 years of dated entries and the way you sat down and said, 'I want to tell you everything in order because the sequence matters.' I've had a lot of people in that chair over the years. People presenting strategies, people asking for things, people managing their image very carefully." She set down her coffee. "I haven't had many people who came in and just told me the truth that cleanly, without performing it." Logan didn't say anything for a moment. He wasn't sure what the appropriate response was to being seen that clearly by someone he barely knew. I just told you what happened, he said finally. That's exactly what I mean, she said. He looked at her. This 30-year-old CEO who'd spent 6 months building a file and 11 minutes responding to his email, and who'd recused herself from his career decisions because she'd understood before he did that fairness required that specific cost, and felt something that was complicated enough that he didn't try to name it. What happens here now? He asked. For the people who stayed, we're rewriting the contractor policy. Every contractor in this building gets the same formal grievance access as permanent employees, and we're putting an outside ombudsman in place so that reporting doesn't run through the company's own chain. We're also restructuring Marcus's division to add a conduct review layer that sits outside HR. She said it plainly, without triumphalism. It doesn't fix 3 years, but it changes what 3 years from now looks like. You'll actually do it, Logan said. Not a question. I'll actually do it, she said. I'm not good at saying I'm going to do something and then not doing it. He believed her. He'd believed her from the first meeting, really, once she'd started talking. Not because he was credulous, but because she had the specific quality of someone who'd decided the truth was less expensive than the alternative, which was rarer than it should have been. He left 20 minutes later, riding the elevator down with the strange, compound feeling of things ending that you'd expected to feel worse about. His resignation letter was already drafted on his personal laptop. Professional, specific, appropriately grateful for the parts that were true. He'd give proper notice. He'd hand off his projects cleanly because that was who he was, and because the people in the bullpen hadn't done anything wrong, and then he'd go. His last day at Callaway Meridian was a Friday in late November. He'd spent the last 2 weeks handing off projects, writing documentation that was more thorough than strictly required because he couldn't stop himself, explaining his methodology on the Q4 model to the junior analyst who was picking it up. He'd declined the small farewell lunch that Carson had offered to organize, not out of hostility, just because a farewell lunch was a social performance he didn't have the energy for, and Carson had accepted this without pressing. Priya appeared at his desk at 4:30. She was wearing a sweater he hadn't seen before, dark red, and she looked like she'd thought about what she was going to say, and then arrived at the desk and was now not sure where to put it. I hope the new place is better, she said. I think it will be. Because of the structure or because of the people? Both, probably. He looked at her. You should document things, keep a folder. Not because this place is the same as it was. I think it's actually going to change, but because documentation is something you should always have, regardless. Priya nodded, slowly, with the look of someone accepting advice they already knew and needed to hear anyway. I'll miss the quiet company, she said, which he understood to mean the specific kind of company he'd provided, present without demanding, nearby without intruding. You barely talked to me for 2 years, he said. I know, she said. That was the good part. He laughed, short, genuine, the kind that surprised him. She smiled briefly, which was unusual on her, and went back to her desk. He finished packing up at 5:15. His desk was clean. His badge would be deactivated Monday morning, and his access to the company's systems would follow. He picked up the only personal items he kept at the desk. Emma's most recent drawing, which was of what she'd described as a penguin trying to understand calculus, and which had been taped to the bottom of his monitor for 3 weeks, and put it in his bag. He walked through the bullpen. He said goodbye to the 2 people he said things to every day, and a few others he'd worked beside in the way you worked beside people in open offices, in close proximity and occasional proximity only, over years. He took the elevator down. In the lobby he stopped and stood for a moment in the large open space, the revolving doors ahead of him, the building noise around him, the end of Friday afternoon energy of people leaving and going somewhere else. He'd walked through this lobby twice a day for 3 years. He'd been invisible in it, the way people are invisible in spaces they pass through rather than inhabit. He walked through the revolving door. Outside, the late November air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that woke you up without being unkind about it. He stood on the sidewalk and shifted the strap of his bag on his shoulder and looked up the street in the direction of the train station, and then he started walking. Emma's school let out at 3:30, which meant she'd been home with Mrs. Callahan for almost 2 hours, which meant there had been snacks and homework and at least one strong opinion about something delivered in the matter-of-fact way Emma delivered strong opinions. He'd be there by 6. He'd make dinner. Something good. Something that took time. Because he had time now, and the idea of cooking without watching the clock was still new enough to feel like something. He walked 4 blocks through the early dark November evening, other people moving around him in the ordinary currents of the end of a week, the city making its usual noise, and thought about the word invisible. He'd chosen it once, had worn it like armor, had told himself it was practical, and maybe it had been, for a while. And maybe it had also been the thing that let Brandon Cross's behavior go unchecked for 3 years, because an invisible person doesn't make a target, but also doesn't make a witness. He wasn't going to be invisible at the new company. Not because he intended to be loud or prominent, but because he understood now that invisibility was a choice you could make for yourself but couldn't control the consequences of. That the space you refused to occupy didn't stay empty, it just got filled by something else. He turned into the train station and went down the stairs and stood on the platform with his bag on his shoulder, waiting for the train, the underground air moving around him with the particular smell of public transit and city and the end of things. The train arrived. He got on. He found a space near the door and held the overhead bar and let the car carry him home. The new company was called Harlan Analytics, and it occupied the 4th and 5th floors of a building on the west side of downtown that smelled like old brick and coffee and the particular kind of ambition that hadn't yet calcified into politics. Logan started on a Monday in early December, which meant the city was already doing its winter thing. The lights strung between buildings, the breath cloud air, the way everyone walked slightly faster because the cold made standing still a commitment. He wore his good jacket and took the train and arrived 7 minutes early, which was who he was, and stood in the lobby for a moment before going up, not from nerves exactly, but from the specific quality of attention that comes with starting something after ending something else. The team was 23 people. Not 200, not the anonymous square footage of Callaway Meridian's analytics division, but 23 people in 2 connected open rooms with the kind of natural light that made actual work feel possible. His direct supervisor was a woman named Diane Chow, 41, who had the manner of someone who'd run teams long enough to understand that the best thing you could do for good people was get out of their way, and the best thing you could do for bad ones was address it early. She shook his hand on his first day and said, "I've heard your work is thorough, and your documentation is meticulous, which we need more of around here, so welcome." He didn't know who she'd heard that from. He didn't ask. The work itself was familiar. Projection modeling, variance analysis. The same underlying mathematics he'd been doing at Callaway Meridian, applied to a different industry vertical and with slightly different tooling that he was up to speed on by Wednesday. He wasn't the most senior person in the room and wasn't trying to be, which felt right. He had a desk near a window that looked out over a narrow alley and a coffee cart that set up at 7:45 every morning, and he could see the cart operator setting out cups with the unhurried precision of someone who took their small domain seriously, and Logan found this oddly steadying. He left at 5:30 most evenings. Not because the work wasn't there, there was always more work than hours, but because 5:30 was achievable, and Emma got out at 3:30, and Mrs. Callahan had her Tuesdays and Thursdays fully booked now with a pottery class, which she'd started in September, and which she described to Logan with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered at 67 that clay was the thing she'd been missing all along. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Emma went to after school until 5, and Logan was there by 5:20, and the math of the day had stopped being something he held his breath through. It was not a perfect life. Logan had never been confused about that, had never constructed some fantasy version of things where everything resolved into ease. He still had the low-grade financial anxiety of anyone raising a child alone on a single income in a city that kept finding new ways to be expensive. Emma had a period in January where she struggled with a reading assignment at school, a level jump that the teacher had said was normal, but which Emma experienced as a personal failing, going quiet and pinched in the evenings in a way that made Logan want to fix something he couldn't fix, that he could only sit beside. He got a cold in February that lasted 11 days, and during which he still picked Emma up from school every afternoon because there was no one else. And he did it in a coat and a scarf, and the particular grim determination of a parent who doesn't get sick days in the ways that matter. But on the other side of those things, the ordinary, uncinematic accumulation of days that actual living was made of, there was also this. He was present. More present than he'd been in years. Not in the distracted, guilt-managed way he'd been present at Callaway Meridian, where some part of his attention was always back at his desk with whatever Brandon Cross had done that day, but actually present, in the room, watching Emma figure things out and make bad jokes and revise her opinions about books she'd already read and develop. Over the course of that winter, a serious investment in the study of birds, she'd gotten a field guide for her birthday from Renata and had started keeping a notebook of species she'd seen, with careful drawings that were scientifically rigorous, if aesthetically eccentric. "What's that one?" Logan would ask, looking over her shoulder at a sketch that might have been a heron or might have been a sentient umbrella stand. "Great blue heron," Emma would say, without looking up. "The neck is harder than it looks." "Anatomically or artistically?" "Both," she'd say, turning the page. He was there for those moments. That was not a small thing. He'd known it wasn't small before, in the abstract way you know things you're not actually experiencing, but now he knew it the other way, the way you know things you'd almost lost access to. The news about Brandon Cross came in February, arriving the way most things arrived in the information age. Sideways, through peripheral channels. A message from Priya at 9:15 on a Thursday morning. She texted him. Not called, texted, which was her mode. Efficient, non-intrusive. "Thought you'd want to know. Heard from someone at Kellner and Marsh. BC started there in January, apparently already on a formal warning. Don't know specifics." Logan read the text at his desk, beside the window with the alley view and the coffee cart below. He held his phone for a moment. Kellner and Marsh was a mid-sized financial services firm on the other side of the city. Logan knew the name, had crossed paths with some of their analysts on a shared industry working group 2 years back. It was a good company, from what he'd understood. The kind of place that took a while to go bad if you introduced something corrosive into it. He typed back, "Thanks for telling me. How are things there?" Priya took 12 minutes to respond, which he read as her being in a meeting, and then, "Different. Better, I think. Still adjusting. The ombudsman process is being used, which is something." Logan set the phone face down on his desk and looked out the window at the coffee cart operator, who was currently in what appeared to be a mild disagreement with a customer about something, gesturing with a coffee cup in a way that suggested the disagreement was friendly and would resolve shortly. He thought about Brandon Cross at Kellner and Marsh. He thought about the formal warning, whatever it was, whoever had filed it, whatever had pushed them to do it. He thought about the 3 years he'd spent not filing anything, running his calculations, deciding the math didn't favor him. He thought about all the other people in all the other offices who were running the same calculation right now, in companies everywhere, deciding that the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of staying silent. Sometimes the calculation was right. Sometimes staying silent was genuinely the safest option a person had, and anyone who'd never been in that position didn't get to judge it from the outside. Logan had made his calculation with the information he had and the constraints he had, and he wasn't going to revise it into a failure in retrospect. But he also knew that the calculation changed when someone at the top was actually paying attention, when there was a mechanism that worked, when the first person who spoke created a record that made it safer for the second person to speak, and the second person speaking made it possible for the third. That was how the math changed, not through heroism, but through accumulation, through a slow tipping of weight until a system that had been favoring silence started favoring something else. He hoped whoever had filed that warning at Kellner and Marsh was okay. He turned his phone face up, opened a new message to Priya, typed, "Good. Keep using it." Sent it. Went back to work. The email from Victoria came on a Friday at the end of February. Logan was at his desk at Harlan, finishing a report that Diane wanted by end of day, and he'd been deep in it, the satisfying, specific focus of work that fit the shape of his mind, when the notification appeared on his personal phone. Not his work phone. His personal one, which meant she'd used the email address from his original open door request, which she'd apparently retained. The email was short. "Logan, I'm in your part of the city on the 4th. If you have time for coffee, I'd like to hear how things are going. No agenda. V? He read it twice. Then he put the phone face down and finished the last section of his report, because Diane needed it by end of day, and that still mattered even when your attention had been slightly rearranged. He sent the report at 4:58. Then he picked up his phone and read the email a third time. No agenda. He believed her about that, in the same way he'd believed her in the conference room that October morning when she'd said she was treating his request seriously. Victoria Hale didn't, as far as he'd been able to observe, say things she didn't mean. She was the kind of person who'd rather say less and mean all of it than say more and have any of it be performance. He typed back, "I have time. What time were you thinking?" She responded in 4 minutes, 10 a.m. There's a place called Osterley on the corner of 4th and Merchant. Good coffee, usually quiet in the morning. He knew Osterley. He'd walked past it twice. He typed, "I'll be there." He spent the evening with Emma, who was working on a school project about migration patterns, birds specifically, which had the benefit of aligning with her current obsession and the slight disadvantage that she now had strong opinions about everything the project's rubric required her to include. They worked at the kitchen table under the overhead light, the way they'd worked on the hot air balloon book report 4 months ago, and Emma argued with 2 of his suggestions and was right about one of them, which he acknowledged, same as always. "You seem a certain way tonight," Emma said at one point, without looking up from her notebook. "What way?" She scrunched her nose, considering. "Like when something's going to happen, but you don't know exactly what it is." Logan looked at her. She was 8 years old and had been reading him like a secondary text since she could talk. "I have a coffee meeting tomorrow with someone I used to work with," he said. "The person from the situation?" Emma asked, which was how she referred to the events of the fall, the situation, in the carefully bounded way of a child who understood that there was a story she hadn't been told in full and was giving it respectful space. "Yes." Emma considered this. "Is it a good meeting or a necessary meeting? What's the difference? Good meetings you look forward to, necessary meetings you just do because you have to." Logan thought about the email. No agenda, the 4-minute response. "I think it might be both," he said. Emma nodded, accepting this, and went back to her migration patterns. Osterley was the kind of coffee shop that had been there long enough to be part of the neighborhood rather than an addition to it. Worn wooden tables, an espresso machine that had clearly survived several different owners, a wall of mismatched bookshelves that nobody seemed to maintain, but that always had something new on them, as if the books came and went on their own terms. It was a Saturday morning, and the place had the specific weekend morning energy of people who were somewhere they wanted to be rather than somewhere they had to be. Logan got there at 9:53. He ordered a coffee and sat at a table near the window and watched the street. Victoria arrived at 10:01. She was wearing a dark coat that he didn't associate with the Callaway Meridian version of her. Something more casual, less architectural. The coat of someone who was off the clock in a way she apparently was off the clock sometimes, though he'd had no occasion to see it before. She had a bag over one shoulder, and she scanned the room when she came in with the quick attention of someone whose default setting was situational awareness, and when she found him, her expression did the thing it did. That small shift, not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. She ordered at the counter and came to the table and sat across from him, put her bag on the empty chair beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was unusual in a social context and not uncomfortable, which surprised him. "How's Emma?" she said, and he liked that she led with that. "Currently convinced that migration patterns are the most interesting thing in the world. We spent last night disagreeing about the rubric on her school project." "Did she win?" "About 50% of the time." Victoria smiled. The real one, the brief one that changed her face. "That sounds about right." The coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around the cup the way she did, and Logan noticed he'd remembered that, the 2-handed coffee cup hold, which was a small and particular thing to have retained about someone. "How's the new place?" she said. "Harlan? Good. The work is good. The people are decent in the way that mostly goes unremarked, which I've come to understand is actually a high standard." He looked at her. "I leave at 5:30 most days. Emma is not complaining." "What are you working on?" He told her. The projection modeling, the variance work, The industry vertical that was different enough from Callaway Meridian's to keep the methodology interesting. She listened the way she listened, which was entirely with questions that weren't perfunctory but showed she'd actually processed what he'd said before responding to it. They talked about the work for a while in the way people who both understood the same subject could talk about it, directly, without translating. At some point, the conversation shifted, the way conversations do when they stop running on social structure and start running on actual interest. "Can I ask you something?" Logan said. "Yeah. When you got my email that Friday night, the open door request, it was almost 10 o'clock. You responded in 11 minutes. Victoria looked at him. "I remember." "Were you working or did you just happen to see it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Both. I was still in the office. I had a board presentation the following Monday, and the deck wasn't right yet." She turned her cup in her hands. "I saw the sender name, and I remembered it from the security clearance review I'd run on the analytics division when I started building the file on Brandon. Your name had come up in the records as consistently delivering work that was rated higher than his assessments of it." Logan looked at her. "He was rating my work low. In his division assessments. Not dramatically, nothing that would trigger a formal review, but consistently. I'd noticed the pattern." She held his gaze. "When someone's actual output is good, and their manager's rating of it is persistently below what independent review would suggest, that's a signal. I was already paying attention to you before your email arrived." He sat with that for a moment, the strange disorientation of learning that the period when he'd felt most invisible had been, to one specific set of eyes, the opposite. "You never said anything," he said. "What would I have said? I notice Brandon is undervaluing your work and I'm keeping an eye on it. To a contractor I'd never directly spoken to, that would have created its own problems." She looked out the window briefly. "I was operating with imperfect information and imperfect options, same as you were. I just had different levers. Did it matter, in the end, that you'd been watching?" "It mattered that I already trusted your credibility before you walked in," she said simply. "When you sat down and started talking, I wasn't starting from neutral. I was starting from a place where the data I'd already seen matched the person in front of me." Logan thought about 3 years of documented entries in a folder on a personal laptop, about choosing to be thorough not because he expected anyone to look, but because thoroughness was what he had available when everything else was out of his control. About doing the work correctly even when its correct rating was being quietly suppressed by the person above him. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I've been thinking about for a while." She waited. "There's a version of this story where I don't send that email," he said, "where I do the same calculation I'd been doing for 3 years and decide the math still doesn't favor me. And I go home and pack Emma's lunch and keep my head down and let Brandon's preemptive complaint define the record." He looked at her steadily. "I came close to that version, multiple times, right up until I sent it. What changed it? A few things. The recording, which removed the option of silence being safe. My sister, who told me Emma needed me to be present in more ways than financially." He paused. "And the word reasonable. You said, in that first meeting, that my calculation was reasonable given my position, that anyone in my situation would have made the same one." He looked at her. "I'd been carrying the weight of it as a failure, the not reporting. The 3 years, you named it as reasonable and it didn't make it okay, but it made it something I could put down." Victoria was quiet for a moment. The coffee shop moved around them. The espresso machine, a woman at the next table talking on a low phone call, someone at the bookshelf running a finger along the spines. "I meant it," she said. "I know. That's why it helped." She looked at him with the direct measuring quality that he'd come to understand as her mode of genuine engagement. Not performance, not professional maintenance, but actual attention. "Can I tell you what I've been thinking about?" she said. "Yeah. I've been building these new policies at Callaway, the ombudsman structure, the contractor grievance access, the revised conduct review process. We rolled most of it out in January. I've been in a lot of meetings about implementation and training and communication strategy." She paused. "And every time someone asks me why now, why these specific changes, why this specific structure, I tell them it's because the investigation revealed gaps in our existing framework." Which is true. It's also not the whole truth. "What's the whole truth?" The whole truth is that a contractor who had every reason to stay silent came into my office with a folder and 3 years of dated entries and told me the truth in order, and the only reason he came at all was that he'd run out of options that involved staying silent. She held his gaze. I didn't create a system where the right thing was easy to do. I created a system where someone did the right thing in spite of it being hard, and the outcome happened to be okay, and I got the credit for responding well. She looked down at her cup. That's a different thing than having gotten it right in the first place. Logan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what it cost to say that, about the specific discipline of a person who could sit with the gap between what they'd done and what they should have done and name it without excusing it. You're changing it now, he said. I'm changing it now, which is better than not changing it, and not the same as having had it right. She looked up. I just wanted to say that directly to you, not in an official context, just, I know what it cost you to do what you did, and I know that the system that was supposed to make that unnecessary had failed, and I'm sorry for the 3 years of it. He didn't say it was fine, because it hadn't been fine, because she deserved honesty in return for hers. He didn't say she should have done it sooner, because she knew that already, and saying it would have been cruelty dressed as honesty. He said, I appreciate you saying it directly. She nodded. They sat with that for a moment, the specific quality of two people who'd chosen to be honest with each other in a context where they didn't have to be, and who were both aware that this was rarer than it should be. What are you doing for the rest of this Saturday? Victoria said, which was a turn he hadn't anticipated. Picking Emma up from her friend Calla's house at noon. This afternoon we're going to the nature center. She wants to add 3 more species to her bird notebook before the end of the month. Victoria looked at him with something in her expression he couldn't fully name. She sounds like a person who decides to do things and then does them. She is. I don't know where she gets it. Victoria's expression said she had some thoughts about that, but she didn't say them, which was a form of restraint that Logan recognized. I'd like to do this again sometime, she said. Coffee. No agenda. She looked at him steadily, giving the words the space to mean what they meant. If you're open to that. Logan held her gaze. He thought about the word navigate, the word Emma had used in the car on the way home from soccer practice, the word Logan had apparently told her at some point, and that she'd absorbed and used back to him with the confidence of someone who understood it better than she had any reason to. He thought about what it meant to navigate something versus surviving it. The difference between moving through difficulty as a means of getting to the other side and choosing at some point to actually be present in what came after. I'm open to that, he said. She nodded once, the same decisive nod she'd given in her office on the 22nd floor when he'd told her something she'd needed to hear, and picked up her coffee cup. They stayed another 40 minutes. They talked about the ombudsman rollout at Callaway, and about the specific methodology challenges Logan was working through at Harlan, and about Emma's bird notebook, which Victoria asked follow-up questions about with what appeared to be genuine interest, and about a book Victoria had read recently that Logan hadn't but noted down, and about what it was like to restructure a company's conduct architecture from the inside while also trying to do the rest of the job, which Victoria described with the dry precision of someone who'd been sleeping 6 hours a night since September. When they stood to leave, they stood at the same time, the natural end of a conversation that had found its own conclusion, and walked out together through the door into the February cold. On the sidewalk, they stood for a moment, the city doing its Saturday morning thing around them, and Victoria said, Tell Emma good luck with the nature center. I will, Logan said. She walked one way. He walked the other. He didn't analyze it on the walk back to the train. He'd made a habit, in the years of raising Emma alone, of not over-examining things that felt right, because over-examination had a way of turning what was simple into something complicated, and what was good into something conditional. He walked 4 blocks in the February air with his hands in his pockets and thought about how the coffee had been good and the conversation had been real and how this specific Saturday morning felt different from the Saturday mornings that had come before it, and that difference was worth something even if he couldn't name it precisely. He picked Emma up at noon from Calla's house. She came out wearing her coat correctly buttoned, which was unusual and suggested she'd been recently reminded, and carrying her bird notebook and the field guide Renata had given her. How was it? Logan asked, in the car. Good. Calla has a finch. It's technically her dad's, but she's taken over the care of it, which I think makes it hers by labor. By labor, Logan repeated. Labor theory of ownership. We talked about it in social studies. He was quiet for a moment. How old are you? 8.5, Emma said. The half matters. He drove. Emma opened her field guide and began studying a page with the intensity she applied to research, running her finger along a column of text. At the nature center, they spent 2 hours walking the trails. It was cold enough that their breath showed, and warm enough that the cold was pleasant rather than punishing, the particular quality of a late winter day that hasn't decided yet whether it's ending or beginning. Emma had her notebook and a pencil, and she moved with the specific focused energy of someone on a mission, stopping when she saw something and going still in a way that was uncharacteristic of most 8-year-olds, but completely characteristic of Emma, who had a rare and powerful ability to be patient when patience was required. She added a white-throated sparrow to the notebook, a black-capped chickadee, which she already had but noted the date of the sighting with the rigor of a scientist, and at the edge of the pond near the west entrance, something she'd been specifically hoping for. That's a great blue heron, she said very quietly, and she was right. It was standing at the shallows with the preternatural stillness of something that knew it was waiting and had made peace with the wait, its neck in the specific S-curve she'd been trying to draw for weeks. Logan stood beside her and looked at it. The heron was extraordinarily still. The pond moved around it in small, wind-touched ripples, and the trees at the water's edge were bare and gray-brown against the winter sky, and Emma stood with her pencil poised over the notebook, taking it all in before she attempted the drawing, giving herself time to actually see it. The neck is harder than it looks, Logan said quietly. Emma smiled without taking her eyes off the heron. I know. I'm going to get it right this time. She drew it slowly and carefully, moving the pencil in short, deliberate strokes, looking up at the heron between each one. The heron did not move. It stood in the shallows with the patience of something that had been doing this long before either of them arrived and would be doing it long after they left. Logan watched his daughter draw. He thought about the fall, the conference room, Brandon's smile, the 11 people in their chairs, the folder on his personal laptop, the email he'd almost not sent. He thought about Victoria in the conference room that October morning, both hands on her coffee cup, listening to him tell her things in order because the sequence mattered. He thought about Priya's sideways communication and Renata's voice on the phone, and Mrs. Callahan's pottery class, and Emma asleep on top of her homework with a pencil still in her hand. He thought about what visibility cost and what invisibility cost, and how neither of them was free, and how the difference was that one of those costs you chose and the other got chosen for you. He'd chosen this. The new company, the 5:30 departure, the Saturday morning coffee, the Nature Center trail. He'd walked out of a building and through a revolving door and onto a sidewalk, and he'd kept walking, not because everything ahead was clear, but because the alternative, staying in a place that had used his silence against him, had finally, after 3 years, become impossible. There was a lesson in that, or there were several, and he wasn't the kind of person who packaged them neatly because neat packaging was usually a sign that someone had smoothed off the parts that were still real. The real version was messier. The real version included 3 years of keeping his head down and making calculations that were reasonable and also insufficient, and a daughter who could read his face better than most adults could read a room, and a CEO who'd been watching him from 22 floors up through evidence he hadn't known was being collected, and a recording that had been edited and an audio file in a building that hadn't been. The real version included the fact that it had gone well, that the evidence had been there, that Victoria had been who she was, that the investigation had landed where it landed, and that none of that was guaranteed, and that there were people in other buildings and other cities who were telling the truth in offices that didn't have building audio, to executives who wouldn't respond to their emails in 11 minutes, and those people's outcomes were different, and that mattered. What he could say, without packaging it into something it wasn't, was this. He had told the truth in a moment when telling it cost him something, and the truth had held. Not because the world was just, or because justice was automatic, or because good things happened to people who deserved them, but because there had been a woman on the 22nd floor who was paying attention, and a building audio system that was unedited, and a daughter who needed him to be present in more ways than financially, and on that particular day, all of those things had been true at the same time. He was aware that on a different day they might not have been. He held that, the way you held things that were true and uncomfortable and didn't have a resolution that made the discomfort go away. He held it and kept standing on the trail beside his daughter, who was still drawing the heron. Emma finished the drawing at last. She held the notebook up in the fading afternoon light and studied it. Logan looked over her shoulder. The neck was right, not perfect. One curve was slightly too steep, the head a fraction too large. But the essential thing was there, the patience of it, the particular stillness of something that knew what it was waiting for. She'd gotten the quality of it, which was harder than getting the proportions right. "That's the best one you've done," Logan said. Emma turned the notebook and looked at it again with the honest assessment of someone who was her own first critic. "The body's a little off," she said, "but the neck is better." The neck was the hard part. "I know." She closed the notebook. "You have to look at the actual thing for a while before you can draw it. If you try to draw it too fast, you're not drawing the thing, you're drawing what you remember the thing looks like." Logan looked at her. 8.5 years old, standing on a trail in the late winter afternoon with her field guide and her notebook and her honest, particular intelligence that was entirely her own. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly right." They walked back to the car. The heron was still at the water when they passed the pond again. Still in the shallows, still patient, neck curved in its S, watching the water. It didn't acknowledge them as they went by, which was correct. It had its own business. On the drive home, Emma fell asleep in the back seat with her cheek against the window and her field guide in her lap. The way she fell asleep when she'd used everything up on a good day and had nothing left to spend on staying awake. Logan drove through the early dark city, the lights coming on in the buildings along the route home, and the particular quiet of a Saturday evening settling over the streets. He drove carefully, the way he drove when she was asleep, and thought about the text he'd send Renata later, the condensed version, because Renata didn't need all of it, she just needed to know things were okay. And about the coffee meeting, and the nature center, and the heron drawing, and the week at Harlan ahead of him. He thought briefly about Victoria, and the word again. The open-ended, genuinely meant again, that didn't have a date yet, but had the quality of something that would. That was its own complicated territory, and he wasn't going to map it tonight. He was going to drive home and carry Emma upstairs if she was still asleep, and make dinner and let the day be what it had been. He stopped at a light 3 blocks from their building. Emma shifted in the back seat, resettling, her hand tightening briefly on the field guide before she relaxed again. The light changed. He drove on. For 3 years he'd made himself invisible because visible things could be targeted, and he hadn't been wrong about that. Visible things could be targeted, and he'd carried Emma's stability as the reason for everything, and that reason had been real. But invisible things could be used too, could be documented in a folder on someone else's personal laptop, rated inaccurately in divisional assessments, made the subject of a bet in a conference room in front of 11 people who looked at their laps. What he understood now, parking in front of their building in the winter dark, was that neither of those were the whole answer. The answer wasn't to be visible or invisible. The answer was to be present, genuinely present, in the room where things happened, in his own life, in the mornings with Emma, and the evenings over homework and the Saturday afternoon trails, where the hard things were patient at the water's edge. He'd gotten there slowly. More slowly than he would have liked, through more years of keeping his head down than had been good for him, through a recording and an email and a meeting on the 22nd floor and a folder that had been the most consistent thing in his life for 3 years. Not cleanly, not all at once. But he'd gotten there. He sat in the parked car for a moment after he turned off the engine, listening to Emma breathe in the back seat, the deep, even breathing of a child who'd spent herself on something she cared about and had no regrets about it. Then he got out, opened the back door, and said her name softly. She woke up the way she did, gradually, then all at once, and blinked at him with the disoriented expression of someone returning from very far away. "We're home?" she said. "We're home," he said. She gathered her field guide and her notebook and climbed out, and he locked the car and she took his hand the way she still sometimes did, without ceremony, the way she'd been doing since she was small, and they walked into the building together. The elevator was working for once. They rode up in companionable silence, Emma leaning against his arm, still halfway in sleep, Her field guide clutched against her chest like something worth protecting. At their floor, she let go of his hand to dig for her house key, which she'd started carrying herself this year and which she took seriously as a responsibility, keeping it in a specific pocket and not another. She found it, unlocked the door, pushed it open. The apartment was warm and quiet, the way it was when you'd been somewhere cold for a while and came back. Logan hung up their coats. Emma went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, which she drank standing at the counter with the field guide still under her arm. "I'm going to redraw the body tonight," she said. "The neck was right, but the body threw off the balance." "Okay," Logan said. "I need the proportions to match, or it won't look like a heron. It'll look like a tall bird having a bad day." He laughed. Full and genuine, the kind he didn't have to decide to have. Emma smiled into her water glass, pleased with herself. He started dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and the field guide and worked on the body of the heron, her tongue at the corner of her mouth, the way it went when she was concentrating, the pencil moving in the careful, deliberate strokes she'd learned to use. Logan stood at the stove and watched the pan and listened to his daughter sketch the outline of a bird she'd stood very still to see, and thought about how far he was from the person who'd sat at this same kitchen table 3 years ago and opened a folder of grievances he didn't know if he'd ever use, and how that distance had been crossed one ordinary day at a time. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't sure he was fully visible yet, in all the ways that meant something. But he was present, in the room, in the life, in the quiet, irreplaceable fact of a Saturday evening, in an apartment where dinner was on the stove, and his daughter was drawing, and the door was closed against the winter, and everything that needed to be resolved had been, and everything that was still becoming, and that was enough. That was, in fact, quite a lot.